Welcome back to the Faith Forward podcast. Jon Ackerman, and joining me today, Mike Haynes. Thanks
Hello.
for coming, Mike.
Yeah, it's great to be back.
So Mike's doing the message on Sunday, and as we often try to do, whoever's doing the message on Sunday, we try to give them this prime piece of real estate right here to hang out during the week and talk a little bit more, because as we always do with this platform, we want the Sunday message to go from not only being the what and the why, but to eventually translate to the how. How do we make this a real, applicable, practical part of life? And so Mike's joining us for week 3 on this series that we're calling Heartbeat. And so if you missed the first couple of weeks, you definitely want to go back. You're welcome to check the podcast, but at least check the messages to see what was covered there. But the short version is that in week 1, we talked about God's heartbeat for his people being this overwhelming ache for every single person to be redeemed. That's his heart. His heart is that not one would perish. And that as part of that redemption, there's also accompanying it acceptance and an implicit value that is placed on each one of us because we're his kids, we're made in his image, and we're invited back into the family. So if you missed that one, definitely check that one out. It's a great starting point for this series and possibly for life in general. But then last week, we were also talking about that God's heartbeat is that as part of his redemptive plan for each and every person, redemption comes with purpose. That you're put back into the family not to work, not to earn your place, but that as part of God's family, you're entrusted with the family business. And so as we accept Jesus' invitation to come back home, it's an invitation to partner with him. And so this week, Mike's going to talk a little bit about, again, you know the drill by now. If you've been watching for any length of time, you're supposed to watch the Sunday message. In case you didn't get there yet, Mike, give us a quick summary of what you talked about on Sunday.
Sure. So essentially we started off just chit-chatting about the fact that we all have areas of natural strength, areas that we do really well, whether it's for Jesus or not. And so then after coming to faith in Jesus, for many of us, it's really easy for us to grab hold of this framework of Christianity that's very simple and very compelling. And it's take whatever you're already good at and do that for Jesus.
Sure.
And that's a really fun version of Christianity. But the problem comes in when God calls us to do something that we're not naturally good at. And so then, but because we feel this pressure to do the thing that God has called us to do, we want to obey, and that's a good thing, but sometimes it goes a little further than that, and it's actually falls into an area that's a little unhealthy. And so because we want to do the thing that God has called us to do, we actually will be begrudgingly obedient. We will be miserably obedient. We'll be what I call miserable martyrs for God's kingdom because we're operating, he's asking us to operate outside of our natural wheelhouse. The problem with this, in addition to us being miserable, is that for some of us, we truly believe that this is God's heartbeat for us, that this is what God wants from his children, is that we be miserable martyrs. And when we open up 2 Corinthians 12, Paul, who, by the way, has as big a wheelhouse as any Christian has ever had. Like, dude is a rock star human being. And so Paul finds himself in a situation writing in 2 Corinthians 12, he writes about a time where he has kind of experienced something outside of his wheelhouse, where he had what he called a thorn. And the thorn, we don't know exactly what it was. We don't know exactly what the metaphor was representing in his life, but we know whatever it was holding him back from doing God's stuff goodly. And so Paul ultimately wound up having a conversation with God. In that conversation with God, instead of God taking away Paul's weaknesses and helping him to be naturally better at whatever the thing was that was holding him back, that he wasn't doing well, that God was calling him to do, God instead just had Paul hold on more fervently to his grace. In that when Paul did that, it completely transformed the way that he experienced operating within God's call outside of his natural wheelhouse. And so the implication for us is that rather than being miserable martyrs, we might just find greater joy and peace and satisfaction when we bring more of God into the picture to supplement us with the area of weakness that we're not naturally good at.
Yeah. It's a really good message. If you missed it, pause us here, go back and check it out. And you shared some great stories about personal application at the beginning part of your message, where this was very relevantly and in some cases even dramatically playing itself out in your life.
Yeah.
And so again, if you want to hear those, you got to go back and check out the message. But speaking of practically, that's always the goal here on the Faith Forward platform. And as I was looking through your notes, Mike, it just seemed like there were two really good opportunities to flesh out, okay, how do I do this? Or maybe how am I trying to do this relative to God's invitation? And so the first one that came up, and you kind of highlighted already, is, and it feels like if I have these gifts and I want to do the Jesus thing well, then I'm just going to do the thing well for Jesus. And so it kind of begged a question for me. And full disclosure, I didn't like that this question came up. Fuller disclosure, I didn't have a better one. And so I couldn't dodge this, even as there was a part of me that wanted to. And so you may squirm in similar fashion as I ask this. And maybe after I ask this, just hit pause and reflect for a second rather than waiting to see how we out ourselves on this question as well. But it's simply this: what gifts do you already feel comfortable operating in without God?
Yeah, like for me, if I'm in a season where me and God aren't that close, like we not tight, but there are still things that I just feel like I can step up to the plate and usually like handle pretty well. This is not going to inspire great confidence in those who are wondering whether or not they should go back and listen to the message that I preached on Sunday. But honestly speaking, like preaching is one of those things where, it's just a gift. Like the gift is there, right? And so teaching, like that kind of stuff, just getting up in front of people and saying words well is something that comes naturally enough that whether I'm feeling the inspiration of the Holy Spirit or not, I feel like I can probably put something together that's going to be pretty helpful for people. So that's definitely an area for me. There are most certainly more. But if I'm just going to out myself one at a time, at least, that is definitely one for me. But what about you? What's an area for you?
Yeah. And, not surprising. Brian and I were talking last week as we were talking about purpose and gifting and recognizing that he and I have some similar giftings. There's some overlap there. And you and I in the same spaces that, all my years in the classroom, especially after I got through the discomfort of my first couple of years. Because in my first couple of years, I felt like the gift of teaching was in there, but I still better prepare just so that I don't feel like I'm going to look foolish. But once I got through those first couple of years, it felt like, all right, let me roll out of bed, brush my teeth, and if I have something prepared, great, and if I don't, I'll figure it out.
Right.
And chances are good it's going to go reasonably well.
Yep.
It may not be my A game, but it's certainly not going to be a total bomb.
Yep.
Probably. And I've recognized that there's some other places as well. Like you said, we'll out ourselves one at a time. But I want to throw this question back out, phrased slightly differently. And again, because the goal isn't just for you to hear us process our stuff, but for all of us to take a step forward in this. And so think about it again in these terms. If God decided not to show up, if God decided not to come through in this particular moment, you doing this particular thing, where would you feel confident in coming through without him? Like, all right, God, you're going to hang me out to dry? No problem. Watch this. And the tension here is that this is absolutely a setup question. Because it's actually impossible. It's actually impossible to come through without God. You can't. But part of what God wants to talk about is the part of you that feels like you can. The part of me that feels like independent of God, separate from God, in some cases in defiance of God, I could get out of bed and teach reasonably well. That piece of me that's fairly convinced that that's reality is perhaps the part that he's most interested in talking to me about, and not necessarily the external manifestation of my gifting.
Yeah. And for me, I hesitate because of course, if it is a spiritual gift, then by nature, it is a gift that comes from God.
Right.
But because God in his kindness is not withholding,
right.
Once that spiritual gift is given, it's there. He doesn't take it away because you haven't been doing your quiet times lately. And so I think the question for me that I have to ponder isn't, can I operate in my gifting and still be helpful to other people without God's explicit presence involved in that, without inviting God into it? I think the question that I need to, that God and I will sometimes have the conversation is like, what am I losing? What do I lose when I don't invite him into that process?
Yeah.
And I think for me, that's been it's raising the bar a little bit on what I want from my life and what I want for the things that God calls me to do that are inside of my wheelhouse.
Yeah. And I like the way you phrase that. What am I missing out on by not inviting him in? Because like you said, it's not like he just, takes the gift back, right? You do have whatever capacity to do the thing that's in you to do. But what's being missed? And so another one for me that I've been reminded of quite a bit lately, mostly because God's been highlighting it a lot, is strength of will. Just like willpower. Like, give me one more thing, we can do it. Oh, one more thing? No problem. We'll get it done. There's a third? All right. We'll do that too. Just the ability to come through, the ability to get stuff done is honestly a place where throughout most of my life, I've felt like I don't care who doesn't show up. God, people, whatever, I'll make it happen. And I've covered some ground on this one, God and I. And I don't like that he's showing me once again that there's some depths there that need to be explored. That there's still more of me that is fairly convinced that I can show up in some areas with or without God and come through. And having to wrestle with, like you said, the gifting is in me. That strength of will or the ability to teach or whatever is in me. But what am I missing out on by even considering the notion that I can come through without him? It's a touchy spot.
It is. It's complex. And like you're alluding to, there are some things that it's obvious that we should do those with God, right? Like, and anyone watching this, anyone listening to this, you hope that when you step into church on Sunday morning, that you are listening to a pastor who has invited God into the sermon that they're preaching, right?
Yeah.
Like
you would hope.
You obviously want that, but when it comes to, getting stuff done, well, that's something that's widely accepted in American culture.
Sure.
That's just part of our culture. That's part of our, to use a phrase from The Message, that's just part of our socio whatever, that shades the way that we see things. So if I can muddy the waters a little bit more and offer something that, again, feels like a no-brainer or feels like something that is a good thing, but I don't always invite God into that space. And that, for me, something that comes very naturally to me is like grace and forgiveness. I will just let it go. Like I can pretty reasonably just let stuff go. And you might think that sounds like a good thing, and it is a good thing, the ability to easily let stuff go and forgive. But the problem is that when I'm not inviting God into that space, that letting stuff go and forgiving people can very easily turn into avoidance of confrontation. It can very easily turn into apathy about the other person and their development. And so, it's really easy for me to let stuff go and forgive. But if I'm not inviting God's Spirit into those spaces of my heart, then sometimes I wind up forgiving somebody to their detriment, right? Like, not that I shouldn't forgive them, I should, but the manner in which I go about reconciling that relationship, it won't be for their good. It'll just be for mine. And that's not what God actually wants of us when he calls us to do these things.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. Not just cutting away some things, but cutting away the entire thing. And, I just don't feel anything anymore.
Yeah.
Good luck.
Yeah. It's cool.
Hope
Whatever,
it works
man.
out, Phil.
Yeah. Hey.
Hope it works out for you.
Yep.
No, and I like, again, the way that you brought it around too, but this is just a naturally good thing. This isn't even just the pastor should be exemplifying this, but anybody as someone who expresses faith and obedience to Jesus, you're supposed to do it, but you can still do good things without him. And so it brings us to, right, the other thing that you mentioned about Paul is that God shows him this place of weakness. God highlights a place of weakness. God maintains a place of weakness in him. And Paul's requests for it to be removed are met with, nope. That this is actually for your good. And one of the things that I think, I don't know if people would say it, they might think it, they might not even realize they're thinking it, that Paul's thorn isn't to create a healthy balance of pride and humility. It's not to recenter the scales, right? It's the reminder that even his strengths aren't him coming through on his own, right? The thorn, and if you've ever had a thorn in your actual flesh, right, it almost grabs your attention away from everything else, right? Yep. You can't ignore it no matter if it's in your hand and you're doing something with your foot, you're painfully aware of the fact that there's a problem with your hand.
Yep.
Right? There's this reminder that there's something here that should not be, and it's grabbing and holding my focus. And so this thorn that Paul is wrestling with, like you said, whether it's a physical malady, whether it's a personal struggle, whatever it is, it's not bringing him back into balance so the pride doesn't get puffed up. It's like the constant trigger of nope, God. Nope, God. Nope, God. And I find this thing fascinating. And you were talking about this in the message on Sunday, that this attractive kind of Christianity of I'm going to take my giftings, I'm going to do it for Jesus. And then I get frustrated when Jesus asks me to do things for him in areas where I'm not strong, where I'm not gifted. And the recentering of all of this is, and we talked about this last week, God never asks us to do anything for him. He doesn't actually need us to do anything for him, right? Paul says that to the Greeks in Acts, right? This is the God who has everything, who owns everything. Like he's good. Mm-hmm. He doesn't have needs, but he wants to do stuff with you. That's the invitation. The invitation is he gave you gifts so that you could come partner with him. He gave you weaknesses or areas where you don't have gifts, whichever way you're more comfortable hearing that. Entirely up to you. Right? He gave you those or didn't give you those so that there would be places where you would have to do it with him. Because the goal isn't doing stuff. The goal isn't busyness. The goal isn't productivity. The goal is the kingdom. The goal is bringing the kingdom, and not just for everybody else, but for you, for me. For me to experience this as part of with. And so it begs the question, and we could possibly end up distorting this, and so we're going to use this word thorn loosely for the next little bit. Mm-hmm. But where are the weaknesses that you're cognizant of at the moment? Where are the places in your life where, all right, I'm good in my strengths, whether or not God shows up, but over here, man, I just don't have it. What are you aware of God asking you to do in the places that you just don't have it? And what do you feel like he's after there?
Yeah. Well, we all have, work, jobs, things that we do really well, and you may operate one way within your job, but then you operate a different way when you're home, or perhaps for some people listening, watching, home is your preference is for that to be a restful, safe space where you don't have to operate the way that you do when you're at work. For a lot of us in ministry, it is kind of similar. It's the same way that, for me, I operate oftentimes at work, especially on Sunday mornings, I operate as an extrovert. I operate like one. I pretend that I am one because ministry is about people, and because I love the people of our church. No offense to the adults, but especially the students of our church. And so I operate like an extrovert, but when I go home, what I'm really after, what I really want, like deep down, what I really want is to rest. I just want to rest. I just want to, I pour out as a job. And so when I get home, I kind of want, I just want that to be a very quiet, naturally, I just want that to be a very quiet, very restful space where not much is required of me. And if you have a family or you've been part of a family, you know that usually isn't the dynamic, right? That's just not the way. If you have property, if you have just responsibilities, right? You know that you don't always get that wish. And so for me, if I were to kind of loosely talk about this word thorn, an area of my heart where I just don't have it the way that I wish I did. And I know that if I'm not operating within God's grace, I know that it's going to hold me back from doing things that God has called me to do. It's this area of introversion and pouring out, and my thorn is that I don't want to people. Right? That's my thorn. I don't want to people. And I wish I had a more concise word for that, but that's the thorn. The thorn is I don't want to people. And it's holding me back, right? It's holding me back. And so, that's definitely been an area, particularly in the last, I would say 6 months. I mean, if you've been here at CFC for the past 3 months, you've heard me talk about this a little bit, that my house has become the place of safety for kids in our neighborhood and beyond. So this has been an area that God has revealed to me lately, man. This is a thorn. This is an area where if God doesn't come through, I'll obey, but I might not be experiencing the fullness of joy that I could be.
Right. And this is one of the theological places of tension that I feel like becomes very, very real as a place of tension, is the difference between a weakness and a thorn. Right? If we go back to Paul's context, right, there was something either he's lacking or he's not good at or he doesn't like or whatever the case is, and he asks God to take it away, and God says, nope. And there's a temptation sometimes, I think, for people to latch onto this thorn thing and say, well, then I don't have to change. Right? I am the way that I am, and that must be the way that God designed me.
Yeah.
And so we have to be very careful. That's why we said up front, and I'm going to say it again, we're going to use this word thorn loosely, because a thorn is not an excuse to just be the way you are. There are some weaknesses. There are some broken places. There are some wounded areas. There are some sinful areas that are actually in need of healing and restoration and correction. And we don't just get to say, well, that's my thorn. And I've had any number of conversations with people that throw that word around because, frankly, they don't want to deal with the thing. And if I can just slap the word thorn on it, then I get a pass. And so what we want to talk about for the next part of this conversation is, are there areas of weakness where you don't currently have a gifting, but that God's inviting you to go anyway? Are there currently areas of weakness where you may never have it, but God's inviting you to go anyway? And are there places of weakness where actually the goal is the weakness itself? It's not the going and doing in spite of the weakness. It's no, we actually need to address this because this, my friend, is actually not you. And it's not permanent. And this isn't meant to stay. It's actually meant to go. I'd like to say yes to this, but the removal of this, there's some steps. And some of those steps bring us back to this idea of with. And some of what God's after is just the breaking of this mentality of four. Right? And you said it before, Paul's a rock star. Dude has more gifts than anybody should rightfully have or could probably know what to do with.
Yep.
And And yet what he's being brought back to is with. Jesus says it in John 15. It's the vine and the branches, right? If you abide in me, I am the vine, you are the branches. Abide in me, and you will bear much fruit, right? It's natural cause. If you stay with me, the stuff is gonna happen. The doing will be done. But there's a whole bunch of folks. You threw out James. The other one that came to mind for me was Philippians 4:13. Right? It's almost like we lop off the last couple words. I can do all things.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
I can do all things because I believe in Jesus.
Right.
No.
Right. Yeah.
Just no. One, you can't. Two, that's horrible theology. And three, it completely misses. That's not what God's asking.
Yeah.
God's not asking you to do 4. He's asking you to be a branch connected to the vine. And so it becomes really interesting when we take a look at this specific place of thorn where God says nope. If we begin to expand that conversation to just general areas where I don't feel like I have it, but I'm curious about what God's doing. Is it do it in the midst of? Is it cultivate a new gift? Or is it this is here to stay?
So I think the beauty of looping in that John 15 passage is that it gives us a word picture for what God wants to do in and through us when we grab hold of grace, when we grab hold of the gospel and stop trying to do things for and start doing things with.
Yeah.
The beauty of being a branch on the vine, right, is that there are things that a branch might not be strong enough to do naturally, but it gains nutrients from the vine and that strengthens the branch. And so I think I know that for me, there have been areas of my life that I was not good at naturally. And then I started inviting God into those spaces. And over time, I became pretty good at them. But I think the point is, I don't know if those are areas of strength for me because I just choose not to operate in them independently.
Sure.
Because I'm part of the vine. And I think our goal is actually to get to a point where we're not totally sure what we're bad at. We might kind of have an inkling, but we just operate well in it because we're grabbing hold of grace, because the Spirit is compensating for the areas of because we're operating in God's grace and being transformed by we don't know. Right. Whether it's continued to be an area of weakness, right? Because we're choosing to remain in. I think that's our goal, and maybe that's a little pie in the sky of me to say, but I think that's at least what we want to shoot for.
Yeah.
And when we do, I think we'll just find that we're better at more. We're better and have more joy in the things that God calls us to do, whether they're things that were in our wheelhouse before Christ or not.
Yeah. Now, as you're saying that, the thought that's coming to mind is at some point, I think the goal is to get to the place where strengths and weaknesses no longer matter.
Right.
Right. They're in the same category of with.
Right.
In an area of strength, I'm doing it with God. In an area of weakness, it don't matter because I'm doing it with God.
Right.
And so you log enough miles with that mentality and you just stop thinking about strengths and weaknesses.
Yeah.
Because the focus is with.
Yep.
Right? The focus is, all right, this is the next thing we're doing. It doesn't matter if I'm naturally good at it because I'm doing it with God.
Yeah.
Oh, we're going to this place. I don't know how to do that at all. Doesn't matter because there's now so many experiences in my rearview mirror of I didn't know how to do that. And God and I somehow walked through that okay.
Yep.
And nobody died probably. Right. And so I know that I know that I know that I can do all things with him, through him, not for him, because he's strength. They're all his strengths, right? There's no weakness anywhere.
He doesn't need you.
Right. Right. There is no weakness in his character list. Right? There's no skill he doesn't have. And so if we're doing it together, everything's in one of our areas of strength, because he's got all of them, right? And so I feel like that starts to become a fundamental shift that takes practice. That cannot be just something that's theologically acknowledged. That cannot be something that's just intellectually acknowledged. That's something that has to be lived. And it's something that has to be lived by being led into enough places where you recognize it don't matter. Mm-hmm. Right? I find it interesting that that's the only letter where Paul talks about the thorn. Mm-hmm. Right? And I don't know that I know what that means. Yeah. But I think that means something. Yeah. Right? It's no longer a focus. Right? And maybe that means it did eventually go away. I mean, maybe God relented and said, all right, we're good with this now. But maybe it meant that Paul stopped seeing his weakness as a weakness. Right. Maybe he stopped seeing that irritation, that impediment, right, as an irritation or an impediment. And because he just kept seeing God show up. And so eventually it didn't matter. It didn't matter that he felt like he wasn't good enough on his own, because he stopped caring about being good enough on his own. And we see hint of that in the verses that outline, and we didn't read all of them on Sunday, but if you were to read that entire chapter, and maybe even a chapter or two before that, you would see that Paul is, his whole point in that passage, and again, we didn't do the whole context of it, but his whole point is that the people he was writing to were discrediting his ministry and saying that there were other apostles who were better and that they shouldn't listen. They were basically throwing shade at Paul and saying there were other people who were better than Paul and trying to discredit Paul. And so part of Paul's purpose in writing 2 Corinthians was kind of to like defend his honor a little bit, kind of to go, no, the message that I have is good. And these other people are, not that all of them are foolish, but like the thing they're peddling you maybe isn't in your best interest, maybe isn't the pure gospel. And so, he kind of starts out on this, and I alluded to it a little bit, but again, we moved on because it wasn't the point of the message. He starts kind of listing off his strengths a little bit. He starts talking about his strengths, but he does it in this way that is so clear. It's almost sarcastic. Mm-hmm. It's almost, this doesn't matter. Like, what I'm about to tell you is so stupid. It doesn't matter. Who cares about this? But since we're on the topic, let me just talk about my accomplishments a little bit. Let me talk about my wheelhouse just a little bit. But I promise you, it doesn't matter, because ultimately what we're talking about and what we're getting to right now, strengths and weaknesses don't matter. Paul is with. Yeah. But then coming out of that, what I love is that Paul demonstrates that he does understand this concept pretty well, that strengths, weaknesses, it's all about with. But then even still, he asks the question. He does. At some point, he asks God the question, hey, is there anything we can do about this thorn? Mm-hmm. And I love the intimacy that even when your theology is on point, that we still, as sons and daughters, we still go to dad and say, hey, is there anything we can do about, like, I don't love this? Can you, I think there's something in that for us, that intimacy with God to ask, because there's nothing wrong with asking, because we've been invited to ask because the veil has been torn, right? So we can go in to the throne of grace with boldness, right? So I love that aspect of it, that he asked, and I would encourage us to ask too. Absolutely. Absolutely. And so continuing to head in that direction of the asking, it may be worth a few questions, right? There are some of the gifts that we're specifically asked to ask for. And using Paul's example, it's okay to ask for weaknesses to be cultivated into strengths. It's okay for weaknesses to be asked to be removed, right? You're his kid. You get to ask. And not just at arm's length, but you get to come close and ask. And I love that he asked 3 times, right? There's something to cultivating our intimacy to the point where we can be persistent with God. And we can be persistent with the right heart of, it's not that I'm trying to beat you down, God. It's not like I'm trying to do the toddler thing to get the win or play mom off of dad or anything else. But my heart matters to him. And if I'm struggling with something, even if he's said it's not a big deal, that doesn't mean that I just need to suck it up, buttercup. I'm allowed to come back and say, God, this thing's really bothering me. Is there anything we can do about this?
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, it then begs the question of, and I love that you touched on this in Sunday's message, that part of where God might be leading us in our weaknesses is not just in working. It might actually be in our relationship with him.
Mm-hmm.
That part of what he might be after is bringing us closer to him, not sending us further into productivity.
Mm-hmm.
And so it begs the question, where are you afraid to go with God? Is it possible that in areas of work, there's perceived weaknesses in you that you're just terrified he's going to ask you to go do? All right, for some people, it's great that John and Mike like to talk and roll out of bed and talk some more. Dear God, no, right? I mean, the three most common fears that exist in humanity are death, heights, which is just fear of death from a high place, and public speaking, which means 2 out of 3 sets of fears would rather be dead than talk in front of a group of people. And so maybe for some people, it's, I'm terrified that God's going to ask me to speak, and I just don't feel like I've got the gift, right? For others, it's people. I'm terrified God's going to send me to people, whether any kind of people or a particular kind of people or a particular quantity of people or people with a particular need that I just do not feel equipped to deal with, let alone help, right? Where's the fear? And I've met any number of people that feel like if I let God into this space, man, I can call my shot now. I know he's going to send me there to those people to do that thing that I've been dreading and fearing and running away from my whole life. So nope, nope. I'm going to preempt your nope, God, and I'm going to say nope. You're not getting in. And so this becomes a really interesting space, I feel like. If the goal is growth, if the goal is connection, if the goal is to actually live out our faith, is to be brave enough to approach God with the question, God, where am I afraid of you in this area of gifting and weakness and calling and purpose?
Yeah. When a few days ago, my son Aiden, who's 9, he asked me a question. I think it was in the car. I think we were in the car on the way home from somewhere. And he said, Dad, if you think of a kind thing to do for somebody, do you have to do it? And I loved that question. What a great question. But I think for me as a father, what I was more excited about was that he felt comfortable enough in our relationship to ask that, because he kind of knew what the right answer was, which actually wasn't the response I gave him. But the purpose of this podcast isn't to dig into moral ethical dilemmas. So I won't get into it, but I love that he asked, because I think we have a tendency to be afraid of going to God, going to Dad, going to Father, when we think we know the answer he's going to give us. We think we know what he wants. We think we know what he's going to make us do. And so we're afraid to bring it up. But I wonder if, just like Aiden didn't get the response from me that he thought I was going to give, I wonder if oftentimes God is waiting for us to ask the question so that he can give us a response that we didn't expect him to give.
Yep.
And it's a better response. It's a Jesus stooping down into the sand and writing something and then coming up and saying, you who have no sin, you do the first thing to stone. No one expected that response. Yep. There was option A or option B, and Jesus chose option infinity, right? Like he just he just went outside and I think sometimes God, our Father, wants to give us responses like that to the questions that we have, but we're afraid to ask the question. We're afraid to go to God. We're afraid to be with, because we think we know what he's going to say.
Yeah. So here's another one that comes to mind. And we'll loop it all the way back to something I said earlier about, one of the places where I feel confident whether or not God shows up is just in getting stuff done. What if, and again, I know I'm not the only one that has that feeling, and I know I'm not the only one, as you pointed out, with mentioning James, it just feels like, all right, this life with God, it's about doing. It's about serving.
Mm-hmm.
What if the thing that you're weak at is not doing? What if one of your areas of weakness that God wants to either cultivate or just cause you to park in is resting? Is a little Psalm 23 action of, green meadows and peaceful streams. And something in you rises up and goes, no, right? God, I have to do stuff. Yeah. I have to do stuff for, I have to do stuff for, we have to do stuff for, right? It is incredibly disruptive. And one of the things that God was reminding me of over the last couple months, and Mike, your message was just so well timed on this. Thank you. I hate you. Is God was reminding me that Jesus was tasked with literally carrying the weight of the world, right? Saving the entire world in a way that Marvel never can. And yet the way that Jesus did that was to find people that couldn't do it as well as he could and to send them out to do it for him. Right? That he finds 12, and then he finds however many multiples of 12, 80 some odd, and he says, go and do these things that I've shown you how to do. And they go out and then they come back and they talk about all the things that they went and did when he wasn't there.
Yeah.
And not that he wasn't with them, and they did it with him, but for him, right? But the way that God chose to work was to call us into the with, even though he could do all of it better than we could. Mm-hmm. And so if he could do all of it better than we could and chose instead to invite us into it with him, sometimes the invitation with him means to not try to do it all yourself. And man, is that an area of weakness.
Yeah.
And I don't think we get to call that one a thorn. That doesn't get to be the humble interview brag of what's your greatest weakness? I work too hard. And that's just the way I am.
Yeah.
Right? No, that's not a thorn.
Yep.
That's an area of cultivation. That's an area of weakness that is meant to be turned into a strength.
Yeah.
And so maybe ask God about that one. So Mike, as we come in for a landing, any final thoughts on this?
To reiterate something from the message, I just think it's so silly and very, very understandable and human that we place the weight of our eternity into God's hands via faith in Jesus Christ and embracing God's grace on us. And we're comfortable with the weight in the destination of our entire eternity hanging on in the balance of the legitimacy and the sufficiency of that grace. But then as soon as we step over the threshold, we revert back to trying to do it on our own.
Yep.
It is the craziest, most human thing. And there just seems to be this really poignant invitation in 2 Corinthians 12, but also everywhere in the Bible for us to embrace God's grace and do things with. Mm-hmm. And know that he's not disappointed in us for not being able to do it on our own, that's not the way this works. And so my final thought is just, man, we've got to embrace the gospel as the lens through which we view now and not just the thing that gets us into heaven.
Mm-hmm.
It has vast implications for now, and those implications will lead us into joy and pleasure regardless of the difficulty of what God calls us to do. So I'm praying that we'll be people who do that.
Nice. And I wasn't ready, but that was a home run.
Thanks.
So thank you for being a part of this. As always, we love your emails. Last time Mike was on this show, I asked you to fill up his inbox, and precisely 0 of you did that. I was a little disappointed, honestly. So here's your second opportunity. faithforward@cfcwire.org. We would love to hear how this is resonating with you. We'd love to hear your questions. We'd love to continue the conversation. We're just grateful that you're choosing to continue your journey with God using this as a small part of it. And as always, we're grateful that we get to be on our own journey and that you're choosing to be part of ours as well. So on behalf of Mike, thanks again. I'm Jon, and we'll see you next time.